Hey everyone, this is DJ Shalene. I'm here with Chris Romeo from Security Journey. Chris, how are you doing today?
And I'm doing great. It is great to be here chatting about all things DevSecOps.
Absolutely. I was talking to you at AppSec USA in DC, and we were talking about the reference architecture that I've been coming up with and working on. And one of the things that I missed was continuous education and that consistent, learning aspect of DevSecOps. And so I remember talking to you a little bit, and we tossed emails back and forth about, some ways that we could get more education content in. And I also asked you to review a lot of the technical architecture. So thank you very much for that. But what did you see from an education perspective that could support the whole idea of DevSecOps and that pipeline architecture?
Well, I think that education in DevSecOps and DevOps in general is something that's really important, and it's not really something that anybody's talking about. And you think about how fast DevOps is changing, DevSecOps is changing. We're adding all these new tools, all these new technologies, and I focus in on the world of security and educating developers and ops folks and all together, with the things that they need to know. But you even think about DevOps in general, just with the velocity of change that we have and tools and technologies and things, there's got to be some way that we continuously educate our users when we're thinking about the people that are using the pipeline here. We got to give them new things to think about, new things to try. We can't just let them grow stale and let the technology kind of run past them.
Where do you think the most focus is from the people you're talking with or that are coming to Security Journey for Education? Any specific part or any technology that the people are looking for?
I mean, we've got people that are doing everything from, there's still a few people that are doing waterfall style development all the way to those that are doing agile. Everybody's on board with DevOps that we're working with right now. And what we're seeing is they're all in different kind of stages. Mm. And a lot of them really are starting to try to think about the security pieces as well as kind of the overall DevOps pipeline. But we're seeing all kinds of technologies and really all kinds of different sizes of organizations that are trying to do this. And it's good that everybody's getting on board and seeing this because, for me personally, I really think this is the future, right? I think all software is going this direction. Even, you think about gigantic companies that are building, think about software for an airplane. Yeah. Well, I mean, do you really want software on an airplane to be pushing 50 changes a day in real time while I'm flying?
You can't fail fast, fail often on a ballistic missile, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, but I mean, I think in 90% of the world, we're going to see where software is going in this way, and we got to be thinking about education, thinking about security, all these things fitting together to prepare people to be able to do this stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting world. It's like completely changed over the past couple of years, where DevSecOps is becoming more of a term that's being accepted, but there's still some resistance to it. But from an education perspective, we can educate all along the way, right? It's not just security; it's other things that we're doing in the pipeline. Now, Security Journey focuses on security. Does it stay on the platform side, or do you do things like Security Maven, Security Champion, organization training?
So our kind of target is for us with a lot of different companies is working with their champions to begin with. And so I spent 10 years of my career at Cisco and was part of the central security team there, building out education, but also being responsible for the security champions. And so that is a part that's really important to me. And I think it's important to always be thinking about champions in the same context as education, because those champions are the people that are passionate about whatever it is that you're doing. Yeah, and I think absolutely. The cool thing about that is, I mean, you could have security champions. I mean, you could even have DevOps champions that were more generalized and not even those that are thinking about just about security. But, the idea of a champions organization or virtual group is, how do we build a community?
Yeah, and, exactly. I mean, like a guild or something.
Yeah, but I mean, DevOps is about community as much as anything else. It's about, the things that you've already mentioned, failing fast and being able to make changes quickly. But it's also about kind of bringing people together into this new community idea that, hey, as devs, we're all in this together. We're now unified with operations and we're trying to push software faster. So I mean, it is really big on the community side as well.
Do you find any friction with breaking down silos between different groups, like, we say DevSecOps, do we just create 3 silos, or something like that? It's hard to break down that cultural sort of resistance, the historical resistance. Do you find any challenges with that?
Yeah, I think, with something like a security champions program, that becomes something that can break down those barriers for us, in that the way I've approached this in the past, I've been very careful to not build a champions program that is siloed in any way. Like, for example, when I was at Cisco running the champions program there, I let anybody come to the meeting to be part of this community. If somebody raised their hand and said, "Hey, I want to be part of this community," I was like, "Rock on!" This is welcome to security, right? Let's get you. If you're someone who's excited about it, let's go ahead and tap into that excitement that you have. And so, I think the champions idea, whether it's for security, whether it's for DevOps, is definitely a way you can break down some of those silos, because people have a chance to interact and see, hey, there's something cool I could be working on, regardless of where I'm coming from.
It's an interesting term. I've never thought about, like, having just DevSecOps champions, right? Because we say security, we're trying to focus on security, and that's more like a security organization coming out and saying that. It's very one-dimensional at that point. And it might have worked when we're just scaling a security program, right? Having a skeleton crew of technical resources. How do you flush that information out and get that community built is one challenge. But how do you see us taking the term security champion and turning it into the DevSecOps champion without losing sort of the essence of teaching security, and how to hack and how to ethically hack, or how to just even explain what a SQL injection is?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely something that we got to be careful about, right? Like, you don't want to create a DevSecOps champions program, which then isolates or says to other people, hey, this isn't really for you. So I think it would really only work in a more progressive organization that's already going in that direction of DevOps. The thing I like about that, and I actually had never thought about that idea before we started this conversation about this DevSecOps champion type of perspective. But when I think about it, I think of how cool it would be to be able to teach some of the even fundamental DevOps principles and tools and things, as well as layering security. Like, when you think about a traditional security champion, it's more like, hey, it's broad. We're covering everything. We might have some people who are writing code in Java. We might have some in C#, some in C and C++. They're all over the gamut, and you're trying to kind of bounce around and keep everybody interested. So the thing I like about the DevSecOps champion idea is you'd be able to localize or focus in on, hey, here's a group of people that are using the same tech stack, using the same pipeline. Let's figure out how we play into them. And so you threw out kind of this idea of, hey, how are you going to teach them to hack? How are you going to, and so I kind of like the second part that you were saying about, hey, how are we going to teach them about SQL injection? I think our industry is so crazy from kind of a red teaming, pen testing, hacking perspective. And so in the way that I approach this, and the way I always have, yes, those are very important things, but they're not the primary thing. They're not the most important thing. And a lot of organizations get really caught up in, well, we want everybody to think like a hacker, and we want them to understand pen testing and all these things. It's like, that's a piece, and that's a piece of what you have in the DevSecOps pipeline now. I mean, you've got the red teaming kind of ethical hacking portion, but it's a small piece in the grand scheme of things. And I think a lot of folks, they suffer from this idea that, hey, if we invest heavily in this kind of red teaming, teaching everybody to hack perspective, we're really going to get the value. And I think you got to push way further back in your pipeline picture to some of those other activities. Sure, you're going to have to do red teaming and pen testing, but don't let that be the focus of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's you're almost teaching both sides of the fence, right? And while you're doing that, you're almost bringing people together in that cultural environment, right? So you're bringing security in, or security education into people who don't have a traditional security background, and getting them excited, and maybe reducing a little bit of that fear, like, oh my gosh, like if I code and do this, it's going to be understanding like what and the impact. And that's the same as a feature, right? But even on the other side is teaching those security folks how to look at those different languages, and not necessarily have to be deep in it, but understand the concerns around it. So with that said, from a continuous education perspective, and with that DevSecOps architecture, where do you see that pinning in to different locations in there, because everything really can be, there's education around all of it. How would you recommend an organization leverage, instructor-based, computer-based training to enhance education along that way?
So I think, like you said, I think that education has to sit above this reference architecture, because it is going to cross all of those boundaries, all those different segments that you have there, whether it's developing or designing integration as you move across. The way that we approach it is we actually take this whole idea of using gamification to get developers excited about being able to learn about security. So this idea of using a security belt program. Right? Mm-hmm. Who doesn't want to say they're a security black belt at some point in the future?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? There's a huge amount of value when someone says, "Oh, that sounds kind of cool. I want to earn that. I want to get there." And so I think the way that you build the DevSecOps professionals that you need to truly operate the pipeline here is you have to start by teaching them the foundational things. That's one of the big mistakes we make. Yeah. We jump in and we say, "Hey, let's teach you secure coding in Python or whatever, in Node, whatever your language is that you're using."
You got to take a step back from that, right?
Well, yeah, because what happens is you take people, you start to teach them, and they get done with it. They go back to their desk and they go, now what do I do? Because they don't have that frame of reference that says, hey, I really understand, one, what is authentication? Two, how is authentication supposed to work? What is this thing called multi-factor or two-factor authentication? Mm-hmm. And then three, now we're getting into the secure coding of how to implement it. Well, if you have that foundation underneath when you're thinking about a security feature in your product, when you start to think about secure coding and how I'm going to deal with authentication, now you understand, one, why do I care about authentication? Two, what's the theory behind how I do it well? And three, now I know how to do it in code.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing I find that happens to a lot of developers is they'll know about authentication, but they think it's username, password, one-way MD5 hash, and that's it. But identity and access management is a way bigger field than just logging into a web page, right? So having the importance behind that, as well as I think that's an interesting part of that education is like, why are you doing it in the first place, and what impact does your code have on the rest of the organization and the product, right?
Yeah, and we get a lot of people that when they first start talking to us, they'll think, hey, that sounds like it's going to be too basic, right? My developers are beyond that. And the challenge I always send back to them is, are they really? Are they really past that point? And a good way you can test is, okay, talk to a couple of different developers from your team, not all at the same time. Ask them what a vulnerability is.
Yep.
And then record the results and watch if you haven't taught that basic thing of what is a vulnerability. You think about it from the third-party software perspective, right? I mean, even what a vulnerability in a third-party library. You'll get different definitions, different explanations from different people. And so that's why you have to do the foundational pieces first to truly layer across your DevSecOps pipeline with the knowledge you need those folks to have to truly be able to perform a secure code review, to look at the results of a SAST tool, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a big part of what you got in the pipeline here. You got your static tools, you've got your dynamic tools, you've got your third party, you've got your container vulnerability analysis tools. If we take developers and say, hey, here's the results that came out of the container vulnerability analysis run of the tool, and we don't teach them anything about it, like they don't have any context.
Yeah, exactly.
They might look at it and go, I don't know what that means. So you know what? Dupe, right? Because that's what devs do when they don't understand how something works. Yeah, false positive, or it's a duplicate bug, right? We already had that somewhere in the hierarchy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept too. It's like when we would scan code, we would get 2,500 bugs, or the vulnerabilities. I just call it work items, but things that you have to do. But we get these results back, and people would look at it and be like, okay, like great. Now what do we do? And the epic failures of DevSecOps book, one of the chapters is one I wrote, which is talking specifically. Yeah, there we go. Talking specifically about that issue, where you have so much code going through there, and you don't have a plan or an educational plan in place, an operational plan in place. How do you deal with these results? How do you get support from a skeleton crew of technical folks?
You just hit one of mine.
And we just said, hey, here's your tool. And it backfired. And those 2,500 vulnerabilities, were fixed with a couple lines of .NET extension that sanitized a string and a search and replace saying toString to sanitize string, and that was it, and they were all gone. But that needed a technology understanding as well as a security knowledge. So,
yeah, you just hit on one of my hot button issues though for static analysis. Any tool you're going to deploy in your build pipeline here, everybody falls for this problem. Okay, you go buy this tool. It might be, you might have spent 7 figures on this tool, and the tool has 100 different things it can scan for. What does everybody say we have to do in the beginning? It costs us this much money, so that's this much per one of those things it can find. We're turning them all on.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it starts to run in the pipeline, and oh look, we have 100. I've seen reports in the past with 100,000 items in them. There's no developer. You can't find me a developer on earth that's going to take that 100,000 item report and say, oh, I'll just spend the weekend. I'll knock these 100,000 out, right? What do they all do? They say, this is not valid. There's no way there could be 100,000 things. And so what I always recommend for folks is when you deploy that tool, pick the one thing in that tool that it's going to detect that is going to have a low false positive rate, and it's going to have a high impact for your environment. Turn that one thing on, and then the devs start to see that tool. They start to think, oh, this is a nice tool. It found a problem. It only had 10 items it found. I could easily take care of those. And then over time, as you start to fix the easy stuff and they start to trust the tool, you've got more ability to crank on some maybe more experimental style features.
Yeah, this is like continuous improvement, right? And not boiling the ocean to start off with. Rather than saying, hey, we're going to scan this .NET code and all of its third-party components. Like, it's just you're throwing the gamut at something without really understanding what your attack surface is or what you're trying to defend against at the end of the day, right? And that's where your threat modeling, your value stream mapping, all that stuff should be done before you select these tools. If you're turning on Java scanning in a dynamic analysis tool and you don't have any Java, why are you doing that? You're just taking more time.
Wasting those cycles. Yeah, and this is a continuous education play as well, in that who's making the decision about what's being turned on in that policy when you first buy that tool? Normally it's the management layer. And so there is a need to educate not only the DevOps, the people who are in the trenches here, running the pipeline, their code's what's being checked in and we're operating upon. There's a need to educate the management layer as well, so that when they get the tool, they understand that philosophy as far as, hey, I know what this tool does. I know how I can have a better impact with it.
Chris, I could ask you thousands and thousands of questions. I only have 2 more though. The first question is, after an application goes to production, what kind of education options do you have? Like, it's not something where you just fire and forget. So how can continuous education help in that situation where the product is gone and now you're in an operational state?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some things. There's some things we have to understand from kind of the ops perspective that are related to that continuous education, like vulnerability scanning. Right. I know in your architecture you have vulnerability scanning, not from a DAS perspective, from kind of the kind of what I think of as classic vulnerability scanners that are operating in that production mode. And you've got some red teaming, I think, that's going to play into that as well. But from an education perspective, I think there are one, I think of education. I mean, I don't really even think about it as separate silos there, from not even silos, but separate phases, because I think of education that sits on top of, I think you need the same education for the design develop. I think that plays into the ops side as well. Like, take a cloud provider, for example. I want somebody who maybe is focusing more on the ops side to understand identity and access management in the same way I want the developer to understand that. Yeah. And that sits above that phase of, of whether you're in production, whether you're in design development. That core knowledge of that information of how IAM works. Now, are they going to use it differently? Perhaps. Maybe they're not going to, the developer's thinking about, how am I building an application that's going to utilize these IAM policies and ensure that when I try to perform an operation, it actually works and it doesn't just error out because there's no permission for it. The ops person may be thinking about IAM from kind of a different perspective of, now we've got the application in production and now we're relying on those IAM capabilities when people try to authenticate to the application or make an authorization decision. So yeah, I think education is going to sit above all the time in this pipeline.
See, and that what you just described is, designing for operations. right? An idea comes out of someone's head. We start planning it. We write a story around it. We threat model it. We go through that process. But right at the beginning, we got to figure out, like, not like a waterfall thing, but how is this going to end up, in that production environment? And are we designing it with, or building it iteratively with the resiliency and all that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some design things, that's one of the things, like, I follow DevOps closely. I'm not as ingrained as you are in kind of the thinking about it, but that's always been one of the things where you'll hear people say, well, hey, DevOps doesn't really have design. DevOps doesn't have, and I don't think you can build anything securely without having some amount of design, like you're talking about. And in that case, it's designing for operations to ensure that you're giving them a stable solution that they can use. But that solution also has to be secure. And
well, exactly, yeah. And that's where, the instrumentation, the monitoring, these kind of things, they happen across the whole, life cycle as well, just like the continuous education, secret management, all those kind of things. So with that, Chris, I had one other question, but you answered it. I was going to say, how do you start? And, the answer I got was pretty much, you need to have that education all the way along the top. And each organization is going to have different requirements, just like each architecture is going to fit different places. You can't just take this reference architecture and say, hey, I'm going to drop it in here. It's just not going to work, right? So what we're talking
and you got to
is,
start. You got to start with those foundational things too. That's the key. That's where I see so many people go wrong, is they dive into the deep end and say, let's talk about all the bits and bytes and all the technical goodness of security before laying that foundation. And then you end up with half your people are just confused because you taught them something that they didn't have the context on why it's important.
Exactly. Well, Chris, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate the conversation. I can't wait to see you again. And with that, talk to you soon.
Cool, man. Thanks.
Cheers.